All right, welcome to, I suppose, not so much a philosophical conversation as more of a book discussion. This is going to be a new format I'm playing around with and starting with a sort of exposition of a book that I published recently, Systems and Subjects, Thinking the Foundations of Science and Philosophy. And that's available on Philosophy Portal, and I'll leave a link in the description below to that if you're interested in picking it up. What I want this book discussion to be, or what this book discussion's method is trying to achieve, is basically I'm going to talk a little bit about the coming to be of this book, the origin of the book, and then I've invited four friends of the channel and intellectual collaborators who were so helpful to me in offering an endorsement for the book before it was published, and have read it and had their own engagements with the book. And when I received their endorsements, it was also very insightful for me, because I didn't know how this book was going to be received, if it would be received at all. And each of their responses and each of their interpretations was sort of a relief in some sense for me, because they were all very different, but they all took something very profound away. So I thought it was going to be interesting to basically invite them on to give a little overview of their experience of the book, their perspective on the book. And then after that, we'll have a little discussion. So this is, again, Systems and Subjects. And in terms of the origin, I'll just be quick, maybe take 10 minutes to talk about the origin of the book for a second, because, you know, it's interesting to focus on the finished product, the result of a thing, but it's also interesting to think about the mess of the thing and its coming to be. And I think it's also interesting to share the mess of that process, because it might open up a perspective for someone who maybe hasn't written a book yet or is thinking about writing a book, to reflect on where they are in that process and how they might relate to that creative drive and that that sort of space, which is very difficult to, let's say, formalize and standardize and mechanize. So my story basically with this book, it's hard to pick where the origin is, but I think I have to pick it in between my master's and my doctorate, when I started working on my doctoral thesis, Global Brain Singularity. And this will become clear as why I'm sort of picking this as the origin, hopefully, as I unfold the story. So in the thesis, I basically had a chance to do a doctoral thesis, and was lucky enough and privileged enough to get 4 years of funding to basically do open-ended research. And this was a time in my life where I was very open to the limitations of my knowledge, and I was very willing to challenge the conceptual structures I had been thinking within. I was trained as an undergraduate in evolutionary sciences, and so I would say that my dominant metaphysics, or my dominant way of seeing the world, was evolutionary. However, when I was doing research for what became Global Brain Singularity, I fell down a rabbit hole, which I would very broadly categorize as continental philosophy. And that included also an interest in psychoanalysis. So what happened, and actually on my doctoral committee, there was one guy on the doctoral committee who, bless him, he really understood what happened in the process of the doctoral thesis, and recognized that, you know, I'd basically moved from an evolutionary point of view to a philosophical point of view, or a point of view informed by continental philosophy. And, you know, what that means very practically, I think, is that I started to play around with the art of dialectical logic. And so while my doctorate was ending, me and a few colleagues were thinking about very practically how we could keep our research projects going. And we did an experiment called the School of Thinking, which is actually still operative. we ended up getting it accepted into our university at the time, the Free University of Brussels. But before it was accepted, we did like a workshop in Paris. Through some connections I had a chance to organize with this other school in Paris. And at the School of Thinking, the idea behind it was that each of the professors or each of the teachers would teach about a different style of thinking. So it wasn't about a certain content, but a certain style or form of thinking. So, you know, there was someone teaching about ethical thinking. There was someone teaching about scientific thinking. There was someone teaching about cognitive thinking. And my focus was dialectical thinking. So I had an opportunity there to explore, you know, basically the method that I've been playing around with in my doctorate. And through that workshop, I had a connection with a man, Stefan Blackfellner, who was leading the Bertalanffy Free Center for Systems Science, and he thought dialectical logic would be a very interesting window into systems science. So I had an opportunity to do a short postdoc at the Bertalanffy Free Center for Systems Science. And this is where the book really started to come into a deeper reality. So I was studying all of the system science literature. I was coming up with research projects and grants and things like that. But at the end of my research on system science, I thought that not only would it be interesting to, from like a meta sense, apply dialectical logic to system science, but I also thought that the content that might be interesting to explore in that way would be putting into a deeper conversation the traditions of continental philosophy and system science. Because system science is based on a very general concept, the idea of a system. And that general category applies to all levels of phenomena, and it sort of violates all disciplinary boundaries. So I thought, like, I'm not just studying physics, I'm not just studying biology, I'm not just studying anthropology, but I can use the concept of system to sort of, which again violates boundaries and speaks to all levels of reality. But I can also put it into conversation with the history of continental philosophy, because I feel like at the end of the 20th century, there was this deep rift between philosophy and science. And I think this was evident, for example, in not only like phenomena I talk about often, like the new atheist movement, where basically there's this idea that, well, we scientists can just pick up where philosophy left off and we don't need philosophy anymore. There's this idea, like Stephen Hawking is famous for saying, you know, philosophy after Kant is useless. And we don't need philosophy anymore. We can just basically say, you know, that physics can handle the rest. So I wanted to really, I guess to use a word that I've been playing around with a lot recently, I wanted to short circuit this discourse between general sciences on the one hand and continental philosophy on the other hand. And, you know, what I stumbled upon was this idea that, what about a dialectic between systems and subjects? Because I feel like what continental philosophy is really speaking to in the modern tradition is the subject. And even though in Bertalanffy's work on systems, I thought that he was very open to this, and there was a lot of potential to engage with him on this question. At the same time, there is a tendency in system science to form a very general abstraction, which doesn't involve the singularity of the subject. Certainly not in the way that you would find in like Nietzsche's work, for example. Like in Nietzsche's work, it's very, I mean, it speaks to the heart. So what you know, that's an example. Or in psychoanalysis, you're literally setting up a system where it's designed for the subject's speech. So I thought there was an opportunity here to really explode these coordinates, and systems and subjects is the result of that explosion. It was basically after now there's a long research phase, like 8 months of doing research and stuff like that. So it didn't just come like that. But once I had done the research, it took me about a month and a half to write the first draft. And then funny enough, COVID hit. and I just kind of left it on a drive for like a year and a half. I would go back and revisit from time to time and clean it up. But the reason behind that was that the Berthollet Free Center didn't want me to publish it without their say so. And so, but after a while, I got the clearance to publish it. So then I just really cleaned it up. And before I sort of pass it on there and let the story of the book go, I'll say the book is structured in 4 parts. And each of the 4 parts, the concept of the system is throughout, but each of the 4 parts takes a figure from the history of the continental tradition and tries to play with them in the background of the unfolding of the discourse. So, for example, in the first part, I talk about Dasein's interior, and my reason for doing that actually is that with Heidegger, oftentimes we speak of him as a clearing. And with Heidegger, before he wrote Being and Time, actually, what he was interested in was opening up the concept of Dasein as a concept to ground science in the shared horizon of their being. And I think that's a very nice idea, that we should think about the sciences within a shared horizon of being. And so we don't think about them as fragmented disciplines, but in some sense within a certain hermeneutical, existential, shared horizon of being. Then the second part, the historical metapsychology, uses Freudian metapsychology, which Freud himself was always trying to accommodate to the scientific universe. But I take a different route, which is that I don't think science was ever buying into this Freudian approach. Like, I don't think they were ever going to, let psychoanalysis be recognized as a science in that sense, but rather taking an opposite route, that science should rather be brought to the level of psychoanalysis. And what that means is to take seriously the speech of the subject, and maybe just coming to my mind here, to take seriously the craft of the voice, as something that's relevant for scientific thought and investigation and attention. Then the third section, Political Overman, is inspired by the idea that Nietzsche's probably one of the most, if not the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And we usually see him as someone who is fighting against Christianity and leaving us with a type of metaphysical power vacuum. And so in this death of God, death of paradigm, however we want to think about it, I think that what we're left with here is thinking the meta horizon of the power vacuum. So what I try to do is try to think the meta horizon of the power vacuum and the will to power in that context of socio-political projects. And then finally, and then I'll stop. The fourth part is influenced by Hegel, titled The Conceptual Absolute. And following Zizek here, I do believe that Hegel casts a shadow on modern thinking, and that there are many philosophies that try to escape Hegel with either references to life or existence or political economy. So the main thinkers coming up here in my mind are like Schopenhauer or Marx or Kierkegaard. And I'm not against any of these thinkers, obviously. But I'm just saying here there's a tension that's still ongoing, internal to philosophy, between what I would say is the life and the concept, or existence and the concept, and the practical realities of the concept. So the window here is basically analyzing a tension that I started with, this tension between science and philosophy, where again, science sort of thinks that we can do away with philosophy, but I still think Hegel is a useful background to think about contemporary science on the level of conceptualization. And so that's my attempt there. And so I'll leave that there. And like I say, we're going to go in the order of the endorsements on the back of the cover. We're going to start with Layman Pascal, then Thomas Hamelryck, Daniel Garner, and then Tim Adalin, and then we'll have a conversation. So Layman, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, maybe you risk letting me go first, but I'm going to craft a voice as a hopefully half unintelligible riff on some of the themes in this book. But first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm here because I support the work of these last of the Cadels in his attempt to revivify the transdisciplinary and forward extensions of human philosophy. And I'm also here because one of my boyhood heroes, Terence McKenna, always used to say with his inimicable overpronunciation, I cut my teeth on Ludwig Bertalanffy. So I'm always down for a Bertalanffy-based text. And as well, quite recently, on my way down to lead this spring's Metamodern Spirituality Retreat, I gave a talk in New York for the endemic group on what they call neo-religion. And there were a bunch of tech guys there. And afterwards, one of them said, I basically agree with all your points, but I'm not comfortable calling this religion. I just think of it as systems theory. Well, I agree with him, but I see it from the other side. I'm not totally sure I'm comfortable calling it systems theory. I just think of it as religion. So that's the kind of eye that I'm bringing into Cadell's book, which admittedly I read a while ago, so it's a titch hazy. The eye of postmodern religion, meta-shamanism, and the metaphysics of adjacency. And from the MOA POV, so to speak, I actually remember that I had a tiny quibble with one of the introductory passages of the text where Cadell says something like, the project is not to provide final answers to fundamental questions, but to play on the frontier in the total absence of final answers, which is a gorgeous sentiment. I couldn't agree more with the spirit of that sentence. But from a metaphysics of adjacency view, I'd just add that we're never in a position to tell if the absence of final answers is total or not. Perhaps total-ish would be more accurate, especially if absence and presence can't be thought apart from each other. So, okay, where does my thinking go in and around and between this text? It starts by wrestling with Bertalanffy and Heideggerian and post-Cartesian subjects. What kind of a subject is that? Well, here we are. We seem to be. There is something like seeming to be, and it is seemingly presupposed by a world of any kind. There's a basic subjective capacity or opening. And I want to say basic instead of fundamental because I want to slander it a little bit in the sense that basic also has a contemporary slang meaning of low taste and cultural crudeness and an almost useless generic set of preferences. Because in some ways, subjective potential is a lowest common denominator kind of thing unless we do something about that. So this subjective availability, maybe what the alchemists would call the low and everywhere overlooked substance with which the work of the human refinery begins its gold-making process. This, whatever it is in ongoing mutual negotiation with a plurality of others and environments. It's dancing with somethings. And the information feedback flows of this dance move through a temporal structure. Not a fixed singular object-like temporal structure, but a plural dynamic temporal structure. The structure is and remembers and anticipates. It has a timelessly timeless look, and it looks to the future. It's a looking to the future, which tells it what it is now and must therefore have been, and allows it to operate both as a prediction engine in the Carl Friston sense and allows it to operate as a pragmatically free choice maker who can co-construct itself in the act of projecting its will into the future. And if that act gets sabotaged, it recoils onto its present and past as though onto a fixed identity. That's the Cartesian psychopathy in a way, although of course there are more generous readings of Descartes that are possible. And I'd add that from my point of view as well, there's an adjacent sweet spot in the temporal structure, the so-called leading edge, where the present and the future touch each other in ambiguity, like a threshold poise for engaging flow states where you don't get out over your skis, as they say, but you do remain tilted into the next moment where the feedback, the others, the novelty will be registered, where you become by self-overcoming, but don't get locked into the anxiety or narrative about indeterminate futures that you pretend are locked into place. Flow states are a form of maximizing self and other organization, and that organization is always relative. It could always be more organized or less organized, given the inputs and contexts it finds with and within. So more organized looks like a greater degree of teamwork among drives, options, and modes of the self. Less organized looks like a regress into having fewer inner subsystems cooperating. Feels bad, shame, death, failure, loss of the ability to generate and relate to value as self-experience. The real stands out there as the loss of the workability of the real. There's obviously a Lacanian focus in this book on how the symbolic order operates to help manage the real, and that the sign of the success of this management is the production of an imaginally infused, salient, graspable reality that could form part of a potent mythic experience of being oneself. I would also say that a sign of success is the unforced perception of the overflow of coherence, unconsciously or consciously projected onto the patterns in our lives and registered back into our system. But I'd maybe pause here for a second and consider that symbolic orders are not all the same. And from one angle, I think that's the heart of this book. You can have a symbolic order that is maladaptive or fragile, or by its patternings favors the regress into less organized states. It befriends the death drive, the symbolic order of Nazi states or purity code churches. We can get into destructive feedback loops between self and system in which we reinforce a sacrilegious life. We do that thing Nietzsche's always complaining about, where we situate the discourse of the highest values into things that are either impossible or which undermine the vital foundations of a living organism's ability to incorporatively make new meaning from the complexity of its encounters. On the other hand, we might be able to rig up a symbolic order that optimizes for those features upon which successful meaning making depends, by building incompleteness and becomingness and collaborative plurality into the very thought structures by which we reflect ourselves and in which we find ourselves as the reflection. Although personally, I tend to pay a little bit more attention to the basic psychotechnology strategies that might be helpful. What are the proto skills necessary to relate wisely to this whole condition? One of them, I think, is attitude. There's an attitude that qualitative growth and the struggles that that involves are good, that all things being equal, we want to be able to resolve contradictions at higher levels rather than avoid them or marginalize them. Another proto skill is the simul grasp of bidirectional tension, the roughly equal holding of the ends of an identified tension, a practice which some of us do instinctively to grab the yes and the no going in different directions and hold them with approximately equal force and undergo what it takes to keep them near enough that they can grow into each other more deeply, and in that manner establish a firmer platform of reconciliation from which to face even more interesting forms of the endlessly unreconciled self and world. Well, I was talking about flow states a few minutes ago, and there's something to be said for the proto skill of staying close to the position where you can access the momentum of successful self and other organizing, keeping the ball rolling. I think it's not for nothing that the least stupid of the saints also suggests that we should optimize for abiding in the sense of prior perfection, insofar as that returns to the world as an embodied unfolding. The emergent transcendental condition that I want to say something about in a few minutes is highly useful if we can use it without succumbing to totalized and reified symbolics. But we're kind of bad at two things. One is feeling good, flow states, perfections. The other is feeling bad. We tend to have a system set up where we get rewarded or ignored during the educational process for our inbuilt capacities, which is kind of useless and isolating, rather than for the amount of effort we're willing to put into entering and trying to resolve confusing situations that feel like embarrassment or failure or impotence, to use a good Eurotrash psycho term. You can't transmute or upgrade symbolic castration by avoiding it. You need to get curious about it, which is something that runs all the way through this text. So along those lines, one of the basic necessary proto skills, again, is learning to intentionally lean into contradiction and paradox, not just cognitively, but emotionally and behaviorally, to want to feel remorse, to reach out for the pain within the pain, which is where the disparate poles are closest to each other and most sensitive to each other, like a chamber of intimacy in which they might be healed, but not in the sense of returning to a primordial condition of healed wholeness, but in the sense of touching each other so that new organizational energy is co-generated. This means a life of what Adlin in the text calls tension. Tension is an unstable arrangement of forces to which there are different solutions. One solution is to collapse into the instability, which is terrible unless done intentionally. That's a hell. Another one is to preserve the instability by superficially negating the tension, by overlaying an assertion, a belief or a stance that says, I'm not subject to that tension because Jesus, because Buddha, because capitalism, because Bob Dobbs, or because I just say so. But the assertion of the non-contradictory stance always fails in the end because it doesn't remove the instability, which just remains to haunt you in the form of the marginalized other until it finally erupts in and as your own form. Another solution is self-neutralization and devitalization. You lower your energy and awareness to the point that there's so little fuel running through the tubes that the impact of their contradictory flows is negligible. When I'm exhausted or incurious or insensitive, I have a lot of leeway not to feel unresolved internal sensation, but that doesn't remove them, and it commits me to a life of exhaustion, insensitivity, and non-curiosity. Another solution would be to access trans-contradictory states, which is a great solution, although generally speaking not permanent, especially if introduced into the system from an exogenous source. And when it's endogenously generated, it turns out to rely, in my opinion, on some version of working with that contradiction tension in the subject itself. But that brings us to the most general solution to the tension of inner instability, which is to allow it, to stabilize it by incorporating it, and to get so delighted about the results of that incorporation that you become willing to live a life based on future efforts of similar incorporations. The stabilization is not the alternative to instability, but a new relationship to the instability. So those are some of the ways of thinking about the proto skills involved in this approach, ways of thinking about how meaning and intimacy are actually produced, because if we don't solve the personal and interpersonal meaning and intimacy and beingness crises, we won't have the resources to solve the meta crisis into which civilization has now strayed in a most fascinating manner. Speaking of the interpersonal, though, whose cultural sacralization is what I would call the properly religious domain, we enter as subjects into a field of relations that has at least two general trends. One I would call degenerative and one regenerative. There are merely social forms which, despite being normal, are prone to being reductive and hollow to the point of malnourishment, families in which we always feel angst, churches that are merely museums for other people being religious at other times, politics whose representationalism represents no one, civic projects that no citizen finds to be awesome, constant recapture by lower order system dynamics. Yet this is also permeated by the ability of human beings to form relationships that are stabilizing and self-transcending and surprising. Social contexts can be mundane and desacralizing even in their highest proclamations, and there are social contexts that are organically sacralizing even in their heresies and transgressive trivialities. So the social subject enters into a complex field in which these are both entangled, and this entanglement, if not rejected, activates a social navigation pattern that can't be reduced to the predictions that we would form merely for semantically activated animals. The justification systems we invent on top of mammalian behavioral investments are not adequate for an optimal description of the complex spiritual life that emerges out of this ambiguity of social relations. So the new pattern is better mapped by an additional descriptive level that I would say has 3 or 4 key features. I think firstly, it involves, and you see it in this text, a historical narrative of narrative changes, whether we think of that as a stage-like development or merely as adaptation to technological shifts, an archaic mode, a traditional mode, a modern mode, a pluralistic postmodern mode, and then something like a meta-modern, post-postmodern, pseudo-Deleuzian, quasi-integral, supra-Nietzschean, plausibly Whiteheadian biodigital reconstructionism, something of that kind. An ongoing Gebserian evolutionary history diaphanously enfolded into the emergent power dynamics and their apparent vacuum that constitutes the perception of the current world. So I think that's one of the features of this additional descriptive level. It also includes something like emergent transcendentals, something like the life of virtues, the affective flavors of self-transcendence, facets of the symbolic order that point beyond themselves to the sites at which a different order of feedback occurs between subject and system, which kind of sounds to me like the theme of a cult classic 1970s espionage thriller called The Vervaeke Conjecture. A philosophy that borders on theology returns, and it describes how the symbolic order is constituted when it connects systems and subjects on the far side of modernist and postmodernist metaphysics. And just as like quarks cannot see sharks, which they compose, there's a veil of unintelligibility between these layers of reality. the holy life, I would phrase it, is better described in relation to qualified transcendentals than by reference to the reductive, cultural, and cognitive extension of animal behavioral investments, which of course and nonetheless continue to be real. I don't want to say a few things about the gods here, but I won't. I think I'm digressing too much, although it's probably not a digression to speak of the gods in a historical moment that is observing the simultaneous movement of aliens and psychedelics and collective intelligence and artificial intelligence into the mainstream. Jim Rudd always says he reaches for his gun when he hears the word metaphysics, but I reach for my Terence McKenna when I hear about ontological flooding. And Cadell references McKenna's machine elves as part of the convergence of the technological and the phantasmatic that forces forth a new order of the symbolic, which may then in turn help to co-generate a realm of meta-shamanic magic in which the intertwining of the real, symbolic, and imaginary gets so weird and nanoscopic and incestuous that each of them can only be defined by the others in a way that's always changing but constantly unveiling and an only semi-intelligible suprapotency of the human species beyond itself. And what's the supreme signifier in that kind of a future toward which the leading edge thinkers of the last 2 centuries have been pointing? It's an absolute, no doubt, but what kind? Does it need quotation marks to amplify itself beyond the merely absolute? How does it simultaneously enact its yin and yang, its simultaneous epitomization of autonomy and communion, of freedom and love, as they call it in this text? How does it stand forth as the balancing act of commitment and openness proposed intrinsically by all ancient notions of the absolute? It demands a condition that is both and neither, a condition that is and is not captured by the totalization force of the absolute. Is there such a condition? A condition that is neither closed nor open without devalidating either of them or merging them into homogeneity? Yeah, it's the condition of almost. It's the adjacency. And therefore, I am almost done. But for the sake of convenience, let us pretend that that means that I am done. Thank you, listeners, and thank you, Cadell.
Thomas, would you like to step up to the plate, sir?
All right. Well, good evening, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and also a bit of a challenge to talk about a book like this. As a scientist, I feel a bit out of my depth after spending some time with this book, which I think is the right the right effect. I actually on a certain Friday a couple of months ago, I was asked by by people at my university to organize an event on a Friday afternoon, and then invite a speaker who would talk about some interesting topic. And so this was in a bioinformatics center. So the audience was a bunch of molecular biologists, bioinformaticians, so people who use computational methods to study molecular biology. And I decided to invite Cadell, and so he gave a 1-hour talk about his book, and he threw Freud at those scientists, and Hegel, and Bertalanffy, and Nietzsche, and I just saw all these scientists sitting there being completely baffled. And afterwards, so this was online, so Cadell was unfortunately not there. And then afterwards, there was this hour-and-a-half discussion over beers, and people being baffled and wondering, is this worthwhile? What can we do with it? And so it had a very, very interesting effect. So this book, what is this book doing? And what I kind of take out of this book is that this book is very much concerned with idolatry. It's very much trying to avoid that people get stuck in a very simple system, and it's so easy to get stuck in a little system. And that system can be your religion, that system can be science. A lot of people are in a little scientific system, and this book is very much concerned with avoiding that. And it brings in a lot of different thinkers, so Bertalanffy and Nietzsche and Heidegger and Hegel and Freud. And it brings all of these thinkers into it creates like this big symphony and it combines all of these thinkers so that you can kind of get an idea of how simple explanations will always be disappointing. And I think this is extremely important in these days because and I think that this refers to what I wrote on the back flap of the book. Let's take a look at the situation where we are in now, right? So we are humans. We're about 300,000 years old, modern humans, if I'm not mistaken. And since a couple of decades, so we've hyper-connected everybody using digital networks. And this is extremely dangerous because of the anthropological structure of human beings, because of the way that human desire works, and the way humans deal with desire, often using violent means. So we have this archaic human. We have networked everybody into huge networks, and also means that we've kind of exposed humans to the desire of other humans. So desire is contagious. Of course, I'm always bringing up Girard. That's my thing. So humans copy the desire of other humans. That's how they figure out what they want. And because they do that, they often get into conflict. So if you cross-link everybody in huge networks and people start copying each other's desire, you get an escalation of potential conflict. So we got a problematic human nature, a problematic anthropology. We've cross-linked everybody into a huge network, which is very dangerous. And on top of that, now, of course, we have the emergence of AI. So that's kind of a very interesting cocktail: ancient humans, networks, and artificial intelligence. So what to do with that? So I think that's basically where this book, I think, is extremely valuable, because it has a lot of ideas that point out or that help you to think in terms of systems, of individuals, in terms of the problematic nature of desire, which of course Freud brings that in. It also brings in the problematic of religion, which is of course something that Nietzsche is very important in. And so it provides a framework, or at least a way to get some ideas from these thinkers and to think through the situation that we are in. So networks, individuals, and AI. So let's start with the first part, which is concerned with Heidegger, or which circles around Heidegger. And already there, it becomes extremely interesting because we have this discussion about Dasein. We have the subject. There's something that feels. There's something that has an experience. Now, this is, of course, directly linked to all this discussion that we are now having about ChatGPT and the emergence of large language models, the emergence of AI. So here the question is, are these big models, are they simulacra of our experiences, simulacra of a human intelligence, or do they actually have an internal experience themselves? So this used to be a very, very abstract question, right? What is consciousness and this and that? Oh, this is a theoretical question, who cares? But now it suddenly becomes extremely important, right? These AIs, are they basically just machines that act like humans, but they're just not smarter than the let's say the chess computers that we had a couple of decades ago? Are they basically just really dumb things, or do they have some kind of internal experience, and what is the effect of that? So I think that they're still extremely dumb. I think that ChatGPT and all of these models, they're just statistical models. They're basically just are very good at convincing us that there is some kind of intelligence going on there, but it's basically just a statistical artifact. But you can see that this discussion is going to become very, very important very soon, because soon we will have machines that it's not clear whether are these things actually conscious or are they not conscious, and what does that actually mean. So already there in that first part, so when I read it, you immediately get thrown into this situation of thinking about artificial intelligence and the influence of artificial intelligence on our world. So that would be part one. Then you have part two, we have Freud. So we have this very complex, very problematic nature of humans. So humans are much less rational than people would like to think, especially scientists. So there was this hope that you know, the hope of Dawkins and Sam Harris and so on. So we just abolish religion, and then we can finally get to the good stuff. So we finally get rationality, and then everything will be a lot smoother. And of course, it's absolutely not like that. So you remove religion, which of course arguably has some problematic and irrational sides, but then suddenly people kind of flock to alternative religions. So they make their own religion. So they become, you have all this new age explosion, you have conspiracy theories. So people just find their own religions. The new religions arise, and they're often much more destructive and much more chaotic and much more irrational than the religions that came before. One of the things I really liked in the book, or one of the ideas that I hadn't heard before, and that's something called Chesterton's fence. So you're walking in a field, and there's this fence, and you don't see any reason for this fence to be there, right? So you just tear it down. We don't need this fence. So Chesterton points out, well, watch out with tearing down this fence, because you don't know why it's there. I mean, there might be some kind of bull around the corner or hiding behind a tree or something like that, and that's the reason that this fence is there. And that, of course, refers to religion, right? So why is religion there? And if you tear it down, will you get something that is better, or will you get something that is really worse? And so Freud is one of the greatest thinkers about religion, I think. So he wrote very important books that point to the nature of religion, and also point out how religion is related to violence and to scapegoating. And these ideas have been explored much further by the French American thinker René Girard. So that second part of the book also is dealing with the question of why do we have religion actually? And the answer there is that religion is there to put some kind of structure on the nature of desire. So because desire is mimetic, because we copy each other's desire, we often get into conflict. So we get into conflict over a mate, over a prestigious job, and so on and so on. So religion is meant to curb desire, basically, to kind of put some kind of structure in. So that's one of the great reasons that religion is there. And this is a very, very simple story, and it seems to be a story that is quite, how shall I put it? It's just a true story. This seems to be the reason why religion is there, to limit our desire. Because if we don't limit our desire, then basically everything, then we end up in big trouble. Now, but just putting a limit to desire is not enough, because then you get into this problem of ossification. And this is again this thing that is often discussed in the book. So we tend to get stuck in very rigid systems. We start believing in capitalism, or in a certain religion, or in communism, or in fascism, and these systems of prohibition, they are going to solve everything. They are going to answer every problem, and they are going to give us a very simple way to live by. And that's where I want to move on to the third part, where we bring in Nietzsche. So if we have religion that gives us rules so that desire doesn't get out of hand, then so there's this danger of ossification. At some point, you also need to be able to relax the rules. And you need to relax the rules in order to maybe develop new ideas, or, for example, to do things that would not be possible under the default prohibition. And a very simple example would be sexual regulation. So religion always tries to regulate sexuality. And that's kind of that's always been something that has puzzled me. Why is religion always telling you how to have sex? That's a very strange thing, right? And the usual explanation is, oh, it's just because there are powerful people who are running the religion and they use the sexuality to have power over other people. I think that's a very, very, very wrong explanation. So religion is actually it's quite a good idea to regulate sexuality. If there's one thing that can get you in trouble, then it's sexuality. And it's sexual competition and sexual conflict. So sexuality says we're going to have very strict rules about sexuality and no hanky-panky. Okay. But that can be very, very boring, because how are you then going to get laid? So you also need to have these spaces and these times where you can relax the prohibitions and where you can find a mate, where you can explore sexuality, and so on and so on. So religion is not only prohibition, but it's also a ritual. It's a ritual where you can do transgressive stuff. So transgressive stuff means that you break the rules, but you break the rules in very specific ways. And I think that this is one of the reasons why Nietzsche is such an important thinker, and why he also features in this book, is because Nietzsche is really the thinker of ritual. He is the thinker of transgression. He is the thinker of we need intensity, we need intensity, we need transgression, we need to break the rules. And it's no surprise that he's such an avid enemy of Christianity, of course. Because that's where Nietzsche kind of goes off the rails. He doesn't really understand that there is prohibition and ritual, that they go hand in hand, that you need to have this let's say this safe container of prohibition, of rules, and that you need to have these other containers where you break the rules and where you can develop new ideas, when you can develop behavior that is not allowed in a time of prohibition. So this is again related to the subject of the book, that you need to have this combination of a preservation of your current state of affairs, because otherwise you just end up in chaos. But you also need to have some kind of space where you can explore and where you can go beyond the known, where you can explore new areas. So I think that's one of the reasons why Nietzsche shows up in this third part of the book. And then the fourth part, we have Hegel. Now that's of course always very problematic for me to talk about Hegel, because admittedly I have never read Hegel. And I will never read Hegel. I think I know a bit about Hegel because I've been talking a lot to Cadell about Hegel, and he convinced me that Hegel is not a charlatan and an idiot, but is actually a really interesting and deep thinker. I just don't want to read him because I don't understand. But Hegel has some kind of very interesting things to say. And there is another thinker that I do understand and that I do read, and that it was already mentioned by Layman, and that is Carl Friston. And there we have again the link to AI and the link to science. So it turns out that Carl Friston, who is developing an idea or developing a model of how subjects work, what the relation is of a subject to an outside world, which is based on very precise mathematical structures, variational inference. You have approximating distributions that try to model what is going on in an outside world, and so on and so on. And so it turns out that these ideas are ideas that are kind of that you can also find in Hegel. Because Hegel was also very much interested in this relationship between the phenomena and the noumena, and he was very much interested in the link between these things. And all of these ideas they also come back in very modern ideas, which are actually ideas that are used in modern machine learning. So the ideas that come back in a thinker like Carl Friston, these mathematical ideas are now used every day by thousands and thousands practitioners, computer scientists, machine learning experts to train their models, to train their probabilistic models, variational inference. So you have this link between a 19th century thinker and a very modern thinker who is dealing with subjects, and that can actually be turned into a mathematics that can be implemented on a computer and that can be used to simulate subjects in a world. So you have all these connections that are extremely interesting, and it turns out that suddenly philosophy is becoming much more relevant because all of these big questions are not abstract anymore. This thing that I built that is walking around and that is talking to us and that seems to make sense of the world just like us, is that thing sentient or not? And why is it sentient? Or do we care? And what is it going to do? So all of these very abstract ideas, they come very, very close to home. And that's why I think that this book is very, very timely. That's why I also mentioned in when I wrote the endorsement in the book that I think it's an extremely important book for times like these. Somebody needs to think in terms of philosophy and in terms of anthropology and bring that and use these ideas to understand what is going on today in terms of enormous digital networks, the archaic nature of human beings, and then soon the artificial intelligence that will be added to that interesting combination. So I started with Chesterton's fence, and I'm gonna end with that. So Cadell is not knocking down any fences. He's not knocking down the fence of Hegel and saying that, well, as so many people are saying, and as I also did, Hegel is just a charlatan. It's very complicated. You can interpret it in any way. No, he's actually reading these books. He's engaging with it, and he's saying, well, let's not break down the fence. Let's kind of take a look at what that fence is. And let's take a look at all the other fences. Let's take a look at the fence of Nietzsche. Let's take a look at the fence of Freud. Let's take a look at the fence of Bertalanffy. I didn't know Bertalanffy, so I have that on my to-do list to really engage with that person's work, because that looks like a very interesting angle to think about the times we are in now. So I think that Cadell has given us a book that brings together the thoughts of a lot of other thinkers, and also sheds a new light to that, brings them to the now, brings them to relevance in the now, especially in these times where we have digital networks, where we have ancient humans, and where we will soon have AI that will amaze us in various ways. So, and I think I will end it there.
Fantastic. Daniel, you're up, sir.
Well, this is a delight to be part of, and congratulations on the excellent book, Cadell. First off, I had to go to the DMV yesterday and get a new license plate, and I really missed an opportunity to go with frickin' machine elves. I'm really disappointed in that. Layman brought that to mind. And second, I really would have liked to have been at that conference you were at, Thomas. That would have been magnificent. You bring up Chesterton. It makes me think he had this part in Ollie Learns to Read brought this to my attention. It's a wonderful channel that she does, where in Chesterton, the circle of the madman is the one who cannot think paradox and is free of paradox because his thinking is too limited and small. And we tend to actually associate thinking paradox with being mad, but Chesterton is bringing to our attention that if you are avoiding paradox, it's precisely because you have shrunk your thinking to avoid the paradox. And Subjects and Systems is certainly not a book that can be accused of small and limited thinking. So I think Mr. Chesterton would be quite pleased of that. To that, Hike, as a system, Lumen, Belfranfrey, I can never say any names. Hike, Hike has this point that everyone knows where he says, no matter how smart you are, let's say you're Albert Einstein, unless you work at the McDonald's down the street, you don't know how many plastic forks they need to order next week. That unless you work there, it just doesn't matter how smart you are, that you actually have to be located in that place to be able to think the problem of that restaurant. What's so interesting now is what you bring into attention, as you mentioned, if indeed we begin to realize that thought is intimately connected with the truth of ontology, which then, of course, would mean the technological singularity is an event, just like Thomas Hamelrick was alluding to. It would seem as if you have to know that in order to think that. In the same way that you have to work in the McDonald's to know what the McDonald's needs to do to order the forks. You're entering a stage where now thinking the relation of subjects and thoughts, you have to know that to be part of the thought that needs to occur. So there's a pre-thought that is now necessary as a kind of meta terrain that people need to share in order to think what's going on. And if you don't share that meta terrain, this could be problematic. It makes me think of the famous subject-object divide, which in many respects, your book is collapsing the subject-systems divide, like the substance-object divide, right? Well, no matter how smart you are, if you're Albert Einstein, whatever, and you're still thinking according to a subject-object divide, no matter how smart you are, you cannot think the thoughts of the quality of thinking that we need today to think the now, because the system-subjects divide has been collapsed. There's a way, I like the title as well, it kind of makes me think when it's systems and subjects, are we at an age where systems is another word for subject and subject another word for systems? Now, obviously, there are distinctions there in the same way that subjects and objects are not the same thing. But once you know that the subject-object divide is no more, then the word subject doesn't mean what it used to mean. And the word object does not mean what it used to mean. And I know Dr. Hamelryck has mentioned Whitehead, process, event, dewdrops of experience. These are the sort of things we have to think now. If we're going to have a sophisticated metaphysics and ontology, and we have to think things like the metaphysics of adjacency that Mr. Pascal has brought up. And I think that's very important. And those who do not share that terrain will suffer for it. It is also quite curious when I think systems and subjects. It does make me think of sociology. And I think of Peter Berger, I believe it was Invitation to Sociology, where in the book, where he says, once you study sociology, you understand that people are kind of like puppets on a string. You're more controlled by the cultural situation, by the paradigms of the day that you realize. But you have the ability as the puppet to look up and see the strings and thus understand the mechanisms of control. And in that understanding of the mechanisms of control, now is the possibility of your freedom, because now you understand how things work, right? Well, once you understand that the subject system divide is closed, or they're more related than you tend to realize, well, now that's the beginning of your freedom, right? Because you can start to think, how do we engineer systems to create the kind of subjectivity we want? Which, of course, thinking the thoughts to so engineer the system would require the kind of subject that can think those thoughts on and on and on and on, right? In our talk where we talked about absolute knowing with Hegel, we made that distinction between the true and the absolute. And based on Wittgenstein, where the truth is everything that is the case, we talked about the absolute is everything that is the case plus you. Thinking of everything that is the case, changing the constitution that everything is the case, ever changing the quality of which ever changes what's there. And what we see in systems and subjects is a presentation of the condition today having something more to do with the absolute than just the mere truth. But of course, there's a problem. Now that you know that, you can't escape knowing that. You have to know that. You have to know that you could look at the strings of the system or the society that changes and structures your subjectivity, which begs the question, why don't you do something about it? Or why do you do something about it? Anxiety. The problem with learning about the capacity of the human being to self-reference themselves is now you know you can self-reference themselves. Once you know that the human being is capable of creating systems that can change their subjectivity, or once you know that thought could perhaps have something to do with the absolute idea, as you talk about, you can no longer go back to a world where you don't know that. It brings to mind that wonderful part in Nabokov's autobiography, Speak Memory, where he talks about one of those pictures. It's all made of a bunch of small pictures, and you suddenly see the big picture. He says, see what the sailor is hidden. And he makes the point that once you see the big picture, you can't unsee the big picture, right? It's like, you see those optical illusions, what you see, you can't unsee it. And what happens today, once we know the relation between subject and system and the ability to actually think in a matter, you cannot go back. And I think Dr. Hamelryck is quite correct, because what would that mean is also the collapse between givens and releases, as Philip Reif and them talk about, is gone. Constraints and freedoms are gone, because the very constraints that exist are a product of what people have freely designed, and therefore they don't have the same authority as they once did. Well, suddenly, as we know, that requires a whole lot of questions of why we chose X instead of Y. And then the subjectivity is terrified by itself, because it has to come to terms with its own desires and wills. And I think the book is quite wise to emphasize the negativity that must be faced. But the key that I think the book suggests is that we tend to, when we experience negativity, take that as evidence of entropy. Yes, this is proving that the universe is falling apart, that it's all going into a heat death. When really, the book suggests that the facing of negativity is the precondition for the possibility of necrophy, the building of order, the building of possibility. And there are a number of things you allude to that sort of suggest that changes in consciousness may actually have an impact on how the universe unfolds into greater order. We are not necessarily doomed, say, for greater and greater heat death, as that Updike poem goes, or something like that. But in order to not be so destined for heat death, it would require a facing of that negativity that is our natural tendency to interpret it as evidence of entropy, because it sucks. Well, if you could actually push through that negativity and become the kind of subject that can work with that negativity, well, then we might be able to talk about necropathy. The image that comes to mind with that is where you talk about the white box. The other one in one of your notes you mentioned that I really like is the river hole, where you are combining together Lacan and Nietzsche, where in Nietzsche, the river is a symbol of becoming, transformation, where the hole in Lacan is a sort of lack. What would it mean to think of lack as a opening for a river? What would it mean to think of the lack of the human subjectivity, that 99% as precisely the condition that is necessary? You have to give up the 100%, to reference Mr. Pascal's work, to be the 99%, because it is only as a 99% that you can be a quote unquote hole that a river comes out of. We have a paper where we say it is only because of the impossibility of the fulfillment of desire that it is possible to have intrinsic motivation. It is because you can never completely fulfill your desire that it is possible for you to be a self-turning wheel. Well, that sucks. Sure would be better if there was a better way to go about doing that. And Dr. Hamelryck is very, very correct to suggest that what we're getting at is closing the divide between, say, restraint and freedom, of which tends to be a source of disaster, right? Well, once you know that the society you create has a mechanistic impact on you unless you can shape it, well, then you create your constraints, which then can arguably destroy the power of those constraints. How do you get a subject that can know they create the systems that organize their subjectivity, and not in that then lose the constraint on themselves that they need to develop as subjects in the way that they seem to need to fully thrive as a subject? In Belonging Again, we talk about, as I come to a close here, in Belonging Again, we talk about givens and releases, right, with Philip Reeve. And if you don't have givens, you're overwhelmed psychologically by possibility. But if you have givens, you run the risk of being the mass of the banality of evil, totalitarian, and different things like that. So for most of society and history, it's been a trade-off of givens and releases. Well, once you know about givens, they can't be given anymore because you know about them. They're thus arbitrary and they lose their existential power to stabilize. So what you would need now is some sort of sociological consideration of gifts, or what Nietzsche talks about as the law that one hangs over their neck and has compelled them, even though they know they didn't have to put the law over their neck, it still compels them in a very powerful way. And that brings me back to the language of the white box, because what's interesting is that it is a box. And the similarity between the black box, of which we can associate with the black hole that sucks everything in and destroys everything, is the black box, and the white hole, which is the theoretical possibility of a source of creation coming into the universe, can be associated with the white box. But the similarity between the two is a box. You are now trapped in something. You are now constrained to something. You are now trapped in your inability not to know that you can self-reference yourself, think about your subjectivity and construct that subjectivity. You are now stuck in that box. That is now a constraint that you cannot escape. And the natural response to that constraint is to be a black hole, to be something that sucks everything in with that horrible encounter of the real, coming to terms with your own wills and desires and not wanting to own them, and sucking in all of the community around you as you deal with the pathologies that develop from that. But what if that box, that it seems very easy for us to be a black hole in, could actually be a white box, a source of creation, a source of possibilities that we have not known before, precisely because we're able to close the subject system divide? This is quite a challenge. This is quite difficult, but this seems to be what we need to think. This seems to be the Mediterranean we have to be in, just like the McDonald's that Haidt talks about, so that we can think the problem of that McDonald's. We have to be in this Mediterranean so that we can think it and take it on. And maybe in the end, we just go down in a fiery blaze. But, as long as we get to go to a conference where everyone drinks at the end after talking about the fiery blaze, I think it'll be worth it. And if we get to call ourselves a community of freaking machine elves, I also think it'll be worth it. But point aside, if we can in fact rise to the occasion of facing this new kind of subject, and if we were to indeed become white boxes, that is precisely because we're a certain hole that we can be out of which a river of possibility can flow out of, then I think that would be a good historical accomplishment. And for that accomplishment to be met, we need books like this. We need to read books like this, and we need to take them to heart. So I'm glad you wrote it.
Tim, sir, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Cadell. Wow. So this the book is a powerful book, and each of these reflections that you've all shared are very powerful sets of reflections. And I feel a bit like I'm walking along and there's powerful gales that are kind of assailing me like an old man, and I'm trying to more or less, okay, hang on, let me just check in. Am I able to take a step? Okay, shit, all right, I'm more or less in orientation. And yet, hang on, there's all of this, right? The wind, a little like a system that I'm blown by, and yet I'm trying to become slightly more one with it. And yet there's an orientation that I have to keep up in order for the constituent parts of me to not be all over the place on the floor, right? Able to, in this case, walk probably to a bench for a sleep. And so this notion, Daniel, of picking up on the, of collapsing the divide, in the case of how I'm relating as this old man walking along here, it's a curious one. You know, partly what it brings to mind is that you know, maybe it can be managed for a moment, for a duration. Now, what is it like to share in that process with others? This community of subjects. I mean, one of the questions Cadell poses at the end: what will become possible for such a higher order community of subjects? And the word "such" there is doing the work of the whole book in some sense. I cannot recapitulate it. And that makes me consider just how difficult it would be to describe the orientations that might be undergoing as I'm walking along with these gales blowing me this way and that way. All these subtle balances and coming into relation. And maybe I dropped that metaphor there, you know, I don't know how far it can take us. But I consider how challenging it is, and the ongoingness of the process, and very much this book makes the case very much, I think, aligned with how we are all relating, that the process of relating with the patterns which orient us, which comprise us in our subjectivity, that we are in this always, in some sense, more or less liminal process of being in knowing and unknowing relationships with, and yet the drive, that motivation, the lack, the creativity, the will, all these different words, is there. And then in the case of more classically considered as system, we're thinking about that which is something external which is acting on, and yet I'm appreciating we are also thinking in a manner that's looking to draw these into a particular kind of relation. There is nevertheless a deep challenge and an ongoing challenge to becoming increasingly aware of what is orienting us, what is influencing us. And when I think about that from the perspective of education, the kind of education necessary for there to be integrous communication in a community of subjects, I recognize, well, just often there ain't enough time in the day. I mean, there's, you know, it takes the whole life of someone. It takes many, many years of an educational process, and as well, and loving and losing and trying and failing and all of these type of things to come to know both something that can approximate an intellectual sense of understanding as well as an existential process of the living and dying of it. And so what it is then for communities of subjects, what it is for discourse to emerge, to cobble itself together, that's not some mere regression. These are fascinating questions, and perhaps perhaps they to recenter the challenge of that is, and I didn't quite fully make that point. Maybe I'll be able to return to it. But you ask another question, Cadell, near the end. It's immediately following. You say, what freedoms will structure their existence, this higher order community of subjects, and then what love will be embodied right here, right now? And, Thomas, you mentioning Cadell showing up and giving a talk at a conference of scientists. And, this question, what love will be embodied right here, right now? I mean, this is an outrageous question in many respects to have informing one's proposition, one's provocation in perhaps, many scientific conferences I could imagine. I mean, maybe almost any gathering I could imagine. I mean, what a thing. And so in some sense, some important sense, so necessary, so profound, to ask this right here, right now. Hey, well, what does this ask of us right here, right now? There's no right here, right now, thinking about it then. And so it brings a certain kind of limitation, this right here, right now. And yet, in principle, that limitation opens up to a way of radically being, which is, less than, it's less than, it is limited, but it's also, something deeply enabling, right? And so this thinking, this relating that steps forward in a way that demands an existential process. I used the term layman, I translated it to metabolization. I closed my other notebook. You didn't say metabolization, but many of the excellent reflections you made. I thought of the necessity for this process. There's something to the metabolization of the deep processing of our context that we find ourselves in, which seems to be really critical here. And it's a metabolization that brings us to the fold as finite existential beings, nevertheless involved in something which is opening to possibility. So I did have one or two questions that I thought, if I wasn't quite able to stitch some reflections together, would be nice to ask. And if Cadell, if you want to reflect on them, there's obviously so much here. I don't know how the hell you're going to respond to it all. So the book, one of its main considerations as the language develops, and I do find it's a book that there's a lot of repetition in it, but it's a really good kind of repetition. It's a kind of repetition that from angles that in some sense are so close yet so far apart offer a representation of the way of relating, of the way of thinking that's being invited into participation, invited to metabolize. And in that sense, it's clearly a work that's been written in a transformative way. I think it was, for sure, would have been an ordeal to cultivate and birth this work. And the ordeal of that, of really engaging with the kind of thinking and the breadth and depth of it, if we're doing the work of really showing up and in some sense in as close to a full address as we can, then there is always this challenge, I feel, and this comes back a little bit to the point that I was trying to get at before with this sort of the community of subjects aspect from the perspective of education. when it's so difficult to orient oneself, and there's an impossibility and an ongoingness to the continued recognition of the patterns which influence us. How to come to some common discourse of understanding about those when they may be more or less perceptible to others, and in the immanence of here and now and our understanding what's possible. Well, we've got to eat, maybe we've got to come back in 3 months, 6 months, 5 years to develop this conversation and share a bit more perspective, so that with deeper integrity we can communicate about more or less the same thing, right? If we're going to be making real decisions and real commitments. Well, and if I'm reading this book then, and I'm a different version of me, younger, maybe I'm a younger person, a different person, and I'm coming to relate with transformative material that's helping to cultivate how I think. I'm also running up against, and this is where I want to offer you like a deep openness for response. I have a sense, I don't. This isn't a critique. But it's for sure represencing the very tension that's at the core of one of the tensions at the core of the work, which is to do with the notion of a meta language. Meta language is one of the terms you use as a variant of naming the repetition of the deep hazard. The existential hazard and an epistemic hazard of an overfixation of an unchanging absolute schema of interpretation, which we could see as me walking along now in the wind. The wind is only coming from this direction, or it works just like this. Now I'm going to adapt in just that way, and then all of a sudden it changes slightly. I'm on my ass, right? And so, when we first met, Cadell, you were using the term meta-language, and I was translating it in my mind incorrectly, because I thought, well, in our very effort to communicate with each other now, we're engaging in what I was understanding as a kind of development, a cultivation of a meta-language, because we're speaking about patterns that we need to not become mere victims to. We want to try and get some distance from and develop some kind of freedom in relation. Not to say there isn't, constraint, as you say. But I certainly understand after reading this book, the intention is to name this absolute unchanging fixed schema of interpretation, the judge above all judges, and that we could just retreat to the meta language in order to stave off the pain of the lack or something like this. And O.G. sort of mentioned this point. And yet, in relating with the book, there is a crafted way of coming into relation with these dynamics, of course in language, but for sure also in energy and relevance realization, and I have so much respect for it. And in that sense, I feel quite close. I feel quite close to the mind that relates with it all. And the question then does continue to remain, I think. And I have perhaps been relating with it in my own way in terms of, well, what could be mediums? What mediums, in addition to text, certainly not in place of it, what mediums, in addition to text, here we are in voice, and here we are in what will soon be an exchange, and of course we're exchanging now. What mediums for philosophy may be necessary to develop or return to, reinvigorate, in order to relate with this problem and the trap, and almost like the inexorability of cultivating what could be interpreted as a meta-language to critique the hazard of meta-languages. And of course, I'm sure you'll speak to the necessity of course, constraint and in some sense the deep virtue of the desire for language that can grip and name and hold steady some order, and that we could say something approximating a meta language can offer, so that it's not just chaos, so that it's not pure relativity, and so that we can realize our interdependent, interconnected nature, and that we can in some sense relate with reality together and choose our way together. And so in many respects, this is one of the, and I like how you end the book. You end the book and it's for me, it's the sign of a good work. The book is ending with questions. Almost feels like I could go and read the book backwards, from those questions. And indeed, the way I often relate with books is I'll pick them up and I'll be like, fuck, do I have to read this in order? Jesus, the constraint of it all. And so I'll just be picking up some. And so it's helpful to read books like this for that reason. And some of these questions, you pose at the end, I mean, these are radical questions. They're awesome questions. And so I'm curious about how you respond to those questions. And I'm curious how we respond to those questions. I've tried in my life, I believe, to apply myself to the embodiment of a philosophy, not of a philosophy again, right? That's the thing, that would not to an embodiment of a meta language, but philosophy as such, right? In a manner that recognizes its medium, its field for participation, to be in the here and now. And of course, that's easier with others about. I do manage it when I'm more or less together with a part of myself sometimes as well. And so I'm obviously, as you know, very curious about the necessity for relating to this question of the development of contexts for subjects to be together among all this great systemic pressure. And so yes, perhaps there's enough there in what I've said. I could try and crystallize some of those questions more, but I'm glad I managed to get through that. Thank you all for your really brilliant reflections. It's an honor to listen to them. And thank you, Cadell, for the opportunity to respond and be here. It truly is an excellent work. Well done.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, I mean, Tim, I think you brought things together nicely, and you reflected in such a way as that it brought it to a very personal dimension where it forces me, or it just brings me naturally to the place where I can relate to it in a personal way, in a self-referential way. And you also highlight the challenge of how am I supposed to respond to all these 4 extended reflections, which is quite a challenge, but I'm going to try. And then maybe what we can do is I'm going to try and offer some reflections, which I hope bring together bits and pieces of what everyone said. And then maybe we can just go in a circle of reflections after that and see where we end up at the top of the hour. So one of the places I'll start is, with you highlighting this quite vivid imagery of like an old man being blown around in the wind. And I relate to that, like I was running around doing bureaucratic things today in the tube system in London, and I felt really tired and I felt really old. I felt like the city was blowing me around in some sense. And I started to, and that's something that's a phenomenon that's been more and more present for me on a conscious level, is just realizing, of course, the older you get, you took a lot of energy for granted, and you just start getting blown around by the natural winds of life. And it can be very difficult to accommodate yourself to this disorientation that you could feel by being blown around. And I think that a lot of adults, Alenka Zupancic in What is Sex asked, where do adults come from? which I think is a really nice question. And I think that the way you're framing this meta language and lack situation is kind of like a lot of people grasp onto a meta language in adulthood precisely as a defense. And this is maybe connected to what Thomas was saying about the theme of the book being somewhat concerned with this tendency to idolatry and having like one language and one system and one ossification where we're going in one direction. What really helped me was kind of what I would say is like something that Layman also pointed to is like the logic of contradiction, the logic of paradox, never giving you like a complete meta language or like a common discourse with all people, but it kind of gives you something which constantly encourages thinking as such and thinking processes as such. And I think the result of that is not like one meta language or one worldview, but actually something which I always appreciated Daniel Garner said about my work in one of our first podcasts, which is that my work doesn't give you one worldview, but if you study it as a whole, there's one drive there. Like everything from my first paper I ever wrote to the papers I'm writing now, there's a common drive in the work. It's not like disconnected in that way, but in order to have, so it's not one worldview, but it's one drive. And that drive stays alive through being willing to think with contradiction or think with paradox, which is inclusive of me, which does mean that I'm constantly disoriented and oriented. And in some sense, what I'm trying to do with Philosophy Portal, like it's not just like, if you look at the external view of Philosophy Portal, what you'll see is teaching certain philosophers. But actually what's going on implicitly at Philosophy Portal is I'm trying to build philosophical cognition, like the capacity to embody philosophical cognition, which is not, I would say, a worldview, but I would say it's a line of thought, like, or thinking as such, like the thinking process as such. And that's what gives you orientation, is that you are this thinking process. And all the external otherness is disorienting, and it's going to get more disorienting. Like, I think Thomas did a great job of highlighting, the artificial intelligence and the machine learning and the internet, digital connectivity. It's all going to get more chaotic and complex. But all we have for certainty and stability and orientation is that we are this thinking process. But of course, it's a thinking process which is embodied. It's the thought of the body, if you want. If we're including dreams, we're including the richness of affect into that equation. It's not just a disembodied subject. And I do think that in order to avoid the hazard of meta language and again, this temptation, quite frankly, of holding on to a worldview just to not get blown away by the chaotic winds, will require such communities. And so, I think this is at least what I see my work as trying to do, is engage in the birth of such subjects. It seems like that would be my major orientation and organizing principle. And in order to take that to the next level, there has to be a relationship between the digital and the physical, which we don't have figured out yet. We haven't figured it out yet. And that's a big challenge for the future of our thinking, is how do we take these really interesting online networks, which to my mind blow away the experience of the university, and did, like, if I compare my experience at the university to my experience in these online circles blow the university out of the water potentially, but we need to ground it and we need to make it more real. And that does involve thinking contradictions. So I organize myself along the line of not just the abstract idea of contradiction, but contradictions which to me have a historical real to them, And so the main contradictions for that would be sexuality and money, or power or economy. So like, however we want to think about that, I usually think about that in terms of libidinal economy. But that's like the grounding line, which if you don't think that, then you're probably gonna get blown away by the real. You know, and I'm open here to new ways of thinking about that, but that's how I get a sort of orientation in disorientation. And I actually get the orientation first and foremost by staying close to the ground. Like it has to be, you know, like with your, you know, if you have a partner, your day-to-day life with your partner, but if you don't have a partner, you know, your day-to-day life with, you know, that energy and the people who are closest to you. And then work from there. And the biggest struggle there, at least for me, is this really, again, this weird divide between the physical groundedness and the virtual communityness. Because, you know, and I think, again, I have found infinitely useful the way Thomas Hamelrick frames this, is like, you have the archaic human and the global connectivity. And I think that's just, but he's thinking about this in the now, like this is smashed together now. And it's like, yeah, like we're dealing with 300,000-year-old biochemical systems and primate processes and primal symbolism. With 10 years, we've gone like at most 20 years, where all of this stuff has come online and everyone's connected, and there's these desire webs which no one really thinks about. Right? Like certainly the new atheist didn't think about this problem. Right? So yeah, that's what I want to just say is like, hopefully a genuine engagement with your line of questioning there. And then that does connect to me with like the major theme of the way Daniel was reflecting on the work, which I really like, is this relationship between science and negativity around the topic of entropy. And that was like low key, like for me in the book, like almost like a secret joy I was having, was really bringing out the fact that a lot of big picture science in the last 200 years was basically sealing our fate into a type of heat death, entropic death type of situation, where everything is going to go to disorder. Like, and there are a lot of analytic philosophers like Bertrand Russell, and even the founder of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, who was basically saying, you know, like, we're going to go down with the ship, you know, and all we can do is like go down with the ship well. But like, we're heading towards a heat death, and that's like sort of the fate of the universe and stuff like this. And I think that that logic only holds if you exclude the subject. But if you include the subject, I think a new picture emerges. And I think what I was trying to point towards, and following what Tim was pointing out about the book, repetitively so, almost like less of a linear narrative as like a fractal pointing at different angles, was, yeah, it's not just a hole, it's a river hole of light. Right. And I like that idea of that Daniel brought up with the river hole of light, which is a combination of Nietzsche and Lacan. Where we have to think about the fact that there's a certain birth of order in our tensions, which we can't see until they're birthed. But we by definition can't know, like if we do engage the tensions in the real, we will birth some. And if we think through it, like, you know, we actually think with them, we can birth something. Like there's something can emerge which doesn't exist now. A certain order which you only know you only assume retroactively is normative, right? Like, and I think like the best example for that, like if you go back to like the early science fiction reflections in the early 20th century, none of them were thinking about the internet. They thought about like robots, but they didn't think about the internet. But like then the internet emerges, and it's like the new global normativity. And like we just assume, like we act as if it's like normal, right? But it's like retroactively, like that's very strange. Like, but something like that could emerge in the future, right? There could be some new emergent structure, new emergent orders that emerge, which future generations just take for granted as, yeah, like this is like the way things are, right? And so like the thought experiment I always give for that is like, and I don't know if I need to rethink the thought experiment, but like, it's like if you just imagine you're a hypothetical disembodied observer at the early universe and there's just like plasma quark gluons like everywhere. That's all there is. And then like you just imagine like what is a giraffe or a lion? It's like that's a very like how did that happen? Right? Like right? Like how did the giraffe and the lion happen? Right? Like but like I think our challenge is to think something of that novelty and that order of difference, and I think that's what we're facing with this soup between the archaic human and the new digital technologies. Is like there's a soup here of elements which is giving birth to something of that order of difference. And I tried to think about that in global brain singularity, and so like at least for me there's a part of my thesis which is mostly interesting from like a speculative futures type of thing, but like trying to think the technocultural as something which is a new order of being, which will give birth to phenomena which are that different. And who knows, right? And I think that brings me a little bit to Thomas, which I think that one thing, there's a lot that Thomas brought up that I really like. And I especially appreciate the way he engaged with each section of the book. Is again, though, like whenever I orient with I would say like what I've seen in you, Thomas, is like your metaphysics is this collision between the archaic human and the digital. And the way you were talking about Chesterton's fences is actually the way I'm trying to develop Philosophy Portal. It's like the things I'm teaching at Philosophy Portal are like Chesterton's fences for the archaic human digital collision. And it's like, okay, we've got a totally new digital landscape. And it seems like a new world is emerging. And it's sort of like what I'm trying to do with Philosophy Portal is like, let's look at the foundational discourses of the modern world and let's see what they are and whether they can be used in this new emerging world or not, and where we could throw them out. And I suppose in that context, like some of the background, like sort of like the before space of why I think Hegel's reemerging is that Hegel's thought was emerging in the context of the aftermath of the French Revolution and the emergence of liberal democracy and the collapse of monarchy. And I think in that space, he was trying to think like the origin of modernity and liberal democracy. And I think where we are now is kind of like in like the, I don't know, like the trash or the wasteland of liberal democracy, like where liberal democracy just does not work as a global organization paradigm. Like, and this to me is, how I think about the rise of someone like Zizek historically, is that he's the philosopher of the post-Cold War era, where you have the collapse of the antagonism between capitalism and communism. You have the emergence of a type of Fukuyama consensus on liberal democracy. The end of history liberal democracy is the form. We're just going to spread it around the planet a little bit. But now we're kind of reaching the realization that that is not how history is working at all. We have the reemergence of the geopolitical as a major tension. Like, it's not just like, we can no longer have like Western Europeans just like, I'm going to go, I've said this before, like, I'm going to go to Japan and I'm going to go to Peru and I'm going to do some aid work in Africa. And like, I'm a global citizen. This type of liberal democratic view of global travel and global culture is only possible in like this pseudo-American universal situation. But now I think we're having the reemergence of the geopolitical in a major way, which to me is also coinciding with the need for the reemergence of philosophical thinking, where we rethink the basic geopolitical coordinates of the world. And I think Daniel brings that up a lot of the times with this, you know, we're like between like Silicon Valley utopianism and like Russian Duginism. Like where with Duginism, you basically have this idea that we're just going to have a multiplicity of truths. We'll have a Russian truth, we'll have an African truth, we'll have an American, we'll just have different Daseins, but we're gonna totally avoid the contradictions of the real global tensions. Right. And I think that's what we need to think today. And then I'll try to connect what I appreciated the most in Layman's thought with, again, bringing it back to Tim, because I think Layman did a good job of emphasizing this leaning into the contradiction, this leaning into the paradox. And in the context of community, new societies, where we do need to ground, we need to think through the relation between the contradiction and the paradox of the virtual and the physical. Because I think there's a lot of tensions in the virtual just because a lot of people are relating without embodied interactions with each other. But like if we had embodied interactions, like in my experience, all the people I've had embodied interactions with, it feeds back into the virtual in a potentially creative way and a very generative way. And, you know, it's not like we're all going to become integrated, I don't think. Like, to me, it's more like we're in these like adjacent networks, and our networks overlap in various ways, but like they're never totalizing. It's not like we're all going into one thing, like at least formally or explicitly. But like there is a sort of common sense of being, and there is a common, you know, there is potential for surprising discourse. There's potential for surprising synergies of discourse. Under the precondition that we lean into the contradiction and the paradox. And I do think that, like, and the final thought there is like this, both Layman brought this up and I think Tim brought this up at the end of the book, there's this emphasis on, like, let's say the contradiction, the paradox of, let's say, freedom and love or autonomy and communion. And I think that it's very easy for people to become in a meta language or in an ideology on one of these ends, right? Like totally freedom against love, or totally love against freedom, or totally autonomy against communion, or totally communion against autonomy. And quite frankly, the people that need to lead in these spaces, philosophical cognition comes to mind, but also in Layman's work, the meta-shamanic subject comes to mind. And so where I'll end is sort of saying is that there's this triad at the end of the science of logic where Hegel talks about a triad of philosophy, art, and religion. And I think we need to think about philosophy, art, and religion as not just system, but also subject. So like the shamanic subject would be on the side of religion, perhaps. You know, the type of, I mean, what I'm trying to do is more on the philosophy, but these categories are all related, of course, and they need to have some sort of dialogue, and we need to understand how they relate to each other in different contexts. So I'll end there, and then maybe what we'll do is just do a circle, like, I guess, like a closing reflection circle on like where each of you are with both everyone else's reflections and sort of what I cobbled together here. And we'll start with Layman and then go Thomas, Daniel, Tim.
Well, maybe I'll just say a bit of what I loved about everyone. I mean, Cadell, I love the whole project of this book of bringing together systems theory with the insights of continental philosophy, because systems, they seem so powerful and they seem like they're potentially open, but they also have this ability, like the meta language, to be closed, to be a ceiling of some kind. And what is it that allows these things to actually be open as opposed to be closed? One seems to be how we hold it. right? We hold it as a singular phenomenon versus holding it as an inherently incomplete and overlapping set of metalinguistic networks. That seems to open it up, and doing the Kierkegaard move relative to Hegel of, like you were just saying, leaning in, allowing yourself to own and be identified as the contradiction and the insufficiency. So I think you're doing both of those things really well, and I appreciate that. And it opens up, if not a new optimism, then a trans pessimism, right? So that we're not just metaphorically, or maybe not just metaphorically, going to the heat death, but we have to require our deep embrace of the heat death to open to a new kind of attitude. And we need a philosophy that incites us to do that and allows us to be surprised going forward. Thomas, fuck Hegel. And I appreciate you introducing AI as a Heideggerian problem at the intersection of subject and system. That really stood out to me when I read the first section of Cadell's book as well. And this, the notion of religion as, I don't quite think of it as desire, but as regulating subjective biopower systems in both a constrained and a transgressive phase. I think that's essential for us to keep in mind going forward at this intersection between the archaic and the emergent digital. And also, I think one of the extra things I'd add to that is religion has this obligation to figure out the support systems needed for people to be capable of being free and constrained. Like, what do they need in their lives to be capable of either and both of those things? Daniel, when you started talking, I put on some slow Ethiopian jazz in the background, and I've got to say it merged perfectly. There's such a musicality to the way you present. It was fabulous, and I really appreciated the way you kept coming back to the fact that you can only unlock certain ranges of problems by being the one who's embedded in that circumstance. Made me think about the questions of ontological design, and how do we set up or encourage the systems that are the place in which we can encounter the circumstances that are the new, and the social dimension in which we might actually be able to welcome the machine elves into the world. And Tim, obviously your old man in the wind thing was hilarious. But what I mostly loved was your tempo, because you're coming back to this call for philosophy to be done now in the immediate circumstance with the things we're facing. And I can hear you doing that when you go at the speed that allows you to do that. So I love that, and everybody's reflections were fabulous. Thanks.
It's all you, Thomas.
Yes, there's a couple of things that I want to mention. The first thing is indeed it's quite interesting, Cadell, what you're doing with respect to bringing people together in new ways, and making use of all these opportunities that digital provides, like this meeting here, which has been extremely interesting to hear all these very different perspectives on this book that we've read, and you come away wiser after an evening like this. And I really think that what you said about the universities is a bit sobering. I work at a university, and it's true, like people don't really have very intense discussions about topics like these. These are dangerous discussions, because you can say something wrong about a sensitive topic, and that can spiral out of hand, and people are aware of that, and they censor themselves. So these types of networks are, I think, very important, and they will only increase in importance, because we are having this global network of prohibition, a form of religion that is based on and that will be more and more based on technology, on AI, that will censor us on a scale that we haven't seen before. I don't think that people are realizing that. That's the real danger, not AI becoming Skynet and eradicating us, but AI being very, very good at telling us how to behave and what to say and what not to say. So we will have a global AI enforced religion of prohibition. Well, that's one aspect of religion. And then I think the only thing that people can do is to make sure that there are these bubbles, these networks that can escape from the global prohibition. And they will provide ritual to some extent. So you can, to some extent, say that these types of meetings are ritual spaces, even though they do contain some transgression, because we talk about things that we will probably not talk about with our colleagues when we are talking about very concrete problems. And maybe that's not a bad thing. So when you're developing a new drug against cancer, then all of these topics are not so important, because you have a very clear task and it's very, very clear what you need to do. So all of these things are a luxury that you probably cannot afford, but you also need to have these bigger conversations and have these in a space where you have a certain freedom. So I think all this open letter, and I'll finish with this famous open letter, or these open letters, because now they're appearing everywhere. Now the ELIS network, the AI European AI network, ELIS has also released one of those big letters. Oh, we are very concerned about AI, right? So there's this cartoon about Mickey Mouse, you know, the Sorcerer's Apprentice. So Mickey Mouse starts trying out some spells from the big book of the sorcerer, and things get out of hand. That's where all the AI people are now. So they realize that now they can do anything, they can see anything, hear anything. And now they're wondering, well, how are we going to regulate this? Who's in charge here? Because we've created something and we're not in charge. So these are basically pleas for where is the authority here? And that can quickly end up with where is the ideology that's going to structure everything. So again, there's this question between, there's this tension between we need to preserve what is here, and we need to have structure and prohibition, but we also need to have an openness that is required for growth and exploration. And again, I hope that the people who are writing these letters, I hope that they start reading books like these. Because if there's one thing that I liked about this book, is that this book wants to be understood. This is not somebody who writes in an obscure way. It's a very clear book. You really would write to be understood. And I think this is the greatest compliment that you give to a writer. I agree with George Orwell there. This person, the person who wrote this book, wrote to be understood.
OG.
You're kind, Cadell, and I completely agree with Thomas there. And that's an extremely high compliment, and it's a fitting compliment. And thank you, Layman, for your kind words. So a few things come to mind. One, I wanted to comment, seems to be sometimes an enjoyment that science can get from entropy. And the question becomes why? Maybe if you say, well, it's not our fault, the universe is going to burn down, so I can focus on my work that has nothing to do with the subject, because we're all going to heat death anyway. So there's an enjoyment and the offloading of responsibility to entropy. And I think that has to be looked at closely. I also think there's something interesting going on with this kind of idea of idolatry that Hamelryck brought up. It makes me think of, Owen Barfield in Saving the Appearances says that, at the end of the day, things themselves are kind of idols because nothing can be its own ground. Everything exists because of a relation. So when I start saying that bookcase is a bookcase as a thing, there's an idolatry inherent with that, because there's only relations. But here's the problem. If you remove the idolatry of thingness, well, then you have to also maybe get rid of solidness in reality as a whole, that there is more processes and events. And then sociologically, that translates into getting rid of givenness that organizes your activity. And now you don't have a societal background to protect you from yourself. And boy, howdy, there's nothing more terrifying than yourself. And once today, increasingly more and more people have to face the terror of themselves, what does that look like? How do you live with that? How do you wrestle down that mysterious dark force, that person that comes in the night if you're Jacob and you're yet to be Israel and you don't know that you might be Israel because that's in the future and you might just get killed by this mysterious figure in the dark first. That is you. I think that leaves a lot of questions. So we've removed thingness. We removed, in a sense, the entire subject-object divide was a kind of Chesterton fix that we removed. All these philosophers helped remove it, not aware that that would expose us to actually no longer being able to say, oh, the reason I couldn't do that was because this object was in the way. Oh, the system kept me from doing it. One of the reasons we actually like the system is because it can be the big other keeping you go away. But if there is no system per se, there is no big system, because we as subjects can make systems that work back on us, so we can reference ourselves in that system and thus have an impact on our becoming in it. There is no big system. That sucks, because that means I can't morally offload to it, and I have to take responsibility for myself. So when we remove the subject-object divide, we could no longer speak about an object that's blocking us, and think in the boundary between thinking and dreaming is a whole lot smaller. You know, we can't be instantaneous in our thinking like a dream, but our thinking is not so bound because we somehow participate in objects, and maybe the unfolding of that thought takes a lot more time and isn't so instantaneous as a dream, but it can unfold as such through time and dedication if we can have conversations like this in community. But let me tell you, the lovely thing about a dream is when you know it's not your fault. I just slept and I'm just in this world. It's not a reflection of my desires and dreams. I'm not doing these things because it's not I just found myself in it. And then luckily, if it's a lucid dream, you can go, oh, it's arbitrary. It's just a dream, right? Well, if the line between thinking and dreaming becomes a lot smaller in reality, we're not going to be able to say that the world we generate is arbitrary or it's not my fault. We'll have to own our dreams. And typically speaking, a dream that we have to own is a nightmare, even if it's a paradise, because we don't like to have to be the kind of being that sees ourselves as wanting that paradise. So there will be a whole lot of negativity that we have to face. And I think that very negativity is the galing winds that we find ourselves in as the old men. And it just so happens to be the case that we are the source of those very winds that are blowing us around. And we didn't know that we were capable of creating those kinds of winds. What now? Well, if you found yourself capable of creating something and doing something to yourself that you didn't know you could do, you're going to need a skill to handle it. And I think what you got at, Cadell, is very important, because if Heidegger is correct, where the philosophical pursuit of a transcendent ground is no more, and basically all of these modern philosophies are saying that's no more, and yet you need something like a ground to not be blown over in the wind, then it seems like what is needed today is something more like modes versus grounds, or like you were saying, a constant drive, right? Throughout history, there's been this question of how can you have something constant that isn't transcendent, right? Like it has to be above change. So we've sought a ground that is constant regardless of change, and that's what's going to ground us, right? Well, now the question is, how can you have a consistency without it being transcendent? Well, that would require a mode that regardless what hits you, you're able to stand. That would require the skill and strength that no matter how hard the wind blows, it doesn't move you, and you're able to keep walking through it. And in fact, maybe you can, get a surfboard and enjoy it, right? But you see, in a world where the source of consistency in the midst of change cannot be a ground, then it will require a skill to maintain the consistency of regardless what happens and what changes, you're able to hold your own in it. And arguably, something that is able to maintain consistency, that is not transcendent of change, is actually more magnificent than a constant that is above the change, because it's above the change. You don't have to worry about it. But if you could develop the skills and modes by which to be in the midst of change and yet hold your own in that midst, and in fact, see your inability to escape that change as precisely a gift, because it gives you the resources to be that white box that can be the river hole that creates the becoming in the midst of that change, that seems like a much more magnificent accomplishment than achieving a kind of transcendent that is thus the case because it is not affected by the change. So it is precisely because we are the old man that is being billowed against by these winds that we find ourselves in the midst of, that we might be able to turn out to be a wise individual, maybe even a Zarathustra. And the Zarathustra doesn't stay on the mountain where the winds do not blow. The Zarathustra goes into the wind. And that's precisely why Zarathustra is an example of a kind of negation sublation that we should strive to rise to. But I think the closing point I will make on that is that would seem to be almost the Levi-Stetson, Benjamin Fontaine doing of the impossible. Because when you're faced with AI and it's like, oh my gosh, what's the human going to be? To stand in the midst of AI that gives you the temptation to offload your decisions to the AI and say no, instead of facing the AI and using it to think for me. Mr. Ebert talks about using AI to offload moral responsibility. We had the AI in Jerusalem, Eichmann in Jerusalem sort of talk, because it's tempting to say, well, I did all that because the AI told me to do. Instead of falling for that temptation, to instead face the AI and say, what am I in light of this? The reference comes back on you, as opposed to using it to escape you. Given AI, what am I going to do? Who am I? What kind of communities am I in? Because the box that we are locked in is precisely the inability to avoid self-reference. Now that AI exists, everyone's asking the question, what is the human being? And here is the question. Can that inescapability of self-reference itself be the new given? Because you cannot avoid asking the question of what will I do given AI? What is the human being given this kind of technology? Who are we? And asking those questions as opposed to avoiding those questions seems to be doing the impossible that must be done today so that we can be children of Nietzsche as opposed to last men that just enjoy watching a guy fall from a tightrope. But if we can do that, and if there is something about self-reference that is the new kind of given that we need today to turn those wins into the opportunity of creation, I don't think it is going to be self-reference. It's going to be something like you do all the time, Cadell, which is Cadell reference. You bring the thought to your experience. You bring it to your lived experience. And to take your lived experience and to give them to other people like us as ways to think through our current condition is a gift. You are taking your life and you're making it a gift. And thus the negation and sublation of sociological givens becomes gifts. But that only works if we move from the self-reference we're forced to do into the Daniel reference, the Tim reference, the Layman, the Thomas, the Cadell reference, and to take our life as the material by which we can give to one another to help us navigate these winds so that we can stay human because we stay our very, very particular singularity, to reference Mr. Hegel. So we have to rise to the occasion of being that singularity. And I think it is precisely communities like this and relations like this that can help give us the strength to maintain and to be that singularity so that we can gift one another. So thank you for the work you do at Philosophy Portal. Thank you for this opportunity and thank you for your book.
Tim, you're up, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone again. So I have a tremendous amount of energy. As you can see, the sun has come up now. And so I have the energy of someone who wants to respond to a number of these threads and share on them. And I'm also not going to be able to fully do that. And it would always, I think it would just be an almost at best anyway, Layman, as you say. So to just touch on a couple things, a point that I've been trying to make for a little while here and there, and it's a response to a number of different dynamics. It's a movement from not an entire negation of, but certainly a movement from holding space to sharing space and what that asks of us. And that's kind of reflected a little bit, Daniel, in the progression of your thought there in that last reflection. On the one hand, this desire for, or the acknowledgement that the proposition that developing modes, as you know, I use the language of modes of orientation as to reference precisely that capacity for orientation in relation to this problem of, as you describe, of groundlessness. In those modes of orientation, there is an aspect of one of the modes for sure that it very much looks like I use a language of surrender. And one of the early metaphors I was using to sort of relate with this was when you're sort of facing a wave in the ocean. And you can, if you're able to stand, and hold your position, you can meet a wave and it can pass through you more or less, but you might get bowled over by it, or maybe more or less you're capable of maintaining your integrity in the force of that wave. But in other cases, you have to dive under it, or otherwise you might have to surrender to its movement. And in surrendering to it, maybe the space, even on the shore that you were seeking to hold, is no longer, right? You're sharing in a different kind of process. I was often as well thinking about this, particularly in the context of the kind of psychedelic communities where there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on therapy and medicine, which is for sure important. There's a lot of talk of holding space, particularly for healing or, let's say, pedagogical contexts where parts are sufficiently disparate or in kind of chaotic relation that having some construct, having some important capacity to hold for hold a space for those parts to find their way into a healthier relation. It's very important. But of course, we hold so long, then, and we can reference systems and subjects here, in our holding, we are also in some sense appealing to something that looks like a closure of a kind, right? And so that's going to run into a number of these problems we've articulated. And so the orientation in the more so to pick up on Layman's language of the meta-shamanic, and if there was ever someone to speak in a meta-shamanic way in the particular constellation of the discourse communities that we relate to online, like Layman, unbelievable. Some of those just spitting those memes is just beautifully, really and forcefully. This movement towards sharing space, what does that look like, hey? And, well, it's certainly a dance of modes of orientation together. But the way I relate to this, I mentioned having more to share than I can with the sun rising is now, and it's fitting that I'm perhaps a little bit unwell as well for this point, because here I am in some sense not what I bloody could be, meeting the day with a lot of this energy, and the connection of this, and in principle, as a potential, if only we were able to hold this particular context, which we cannot, right? Actually, because we would be incapable probably, or at least we've preordained that we are incapable of continuing to share this space together. So we have to, submit to the holding that we've agreed to, because the lived context of our lives in the current system, that nevertheless I am feeling like I am not in this temporally bound sense able to orient very much. The winds do seem to be forces of nature as well, and as much as I participate as influence in that context, I've been knocked over enough to not have sort of mistaken illusions of myself in relation to that. And yet, nevertheless, we have to contend with that, as you say, Daniel. And so I have a tremendous energy to discuss the challenges associated with this movement towards sharing space in the grand sense, in the context of the digital communities we've been are a part of. I say we've been. I certainly desire to continue to interact, although I found myself, I would say, like, quite, in some sense, existentially as well as practically more disconnected than I've been for the last 5 years or so, in terms of relating with communities that have sometimes been referenced as ones I've been involved with. Partly because there has not been what has felt like enough of an openness towards actually really building a life in relation to those contexts. And obviously there's so much to talk about there, but I have to just bring that down. But and also because in this movement towards holding events and with people locally and relating to people at very, very different levels of exposure and interest to be exposed and relate with these kinds of discourse, then of course I'm meeting people in very different contexts, and yet seeking to hold that bridge, certainly grounded in a welcoming and a meeting in the mix of orientation that is in integrity with how we are here and otherwise aspiring. And yet nevertheless the language is of course very different. And the challenge, for instance, of attracting people in the local context to engage with this becomes itself an interesting way to look at some of the questions we're relating to in terms of how to bring the digital into the local. I've certainly been, I only started doing online maybe like 20 podcasts in or so. I had quite a commitment to doing all of these things in person. Obviously, COVID was there, but so too was the fact that I ran out of money. Yeah, and this is Australia. And flight tickets only going up. And so it's a challenge. It's a challenge to continue to see people in person. So trying to build those contexts, continue to do that. Very much desire to continue this dialogue. It's always an immense opportunity when so much energy and insight has been furnished now in the contextual space between us, And it feels like there's all this that can be, related with by virtue of that. But typically, in the age of the digital, here we are for a moment, and now the work of being with, as Cadell would say, the negativity of the absence of this begins. And interestingly, I do believe that it's because of relating with that well that I feel as though, that is directly, I think it's directly associated with capacity to conjure the context for interaction online that has that generative intensity to it. And so it is, it is par for the course. So yes, to be continued, and that in many respects is as well something which might as well perhaps have been written at the end of the book, to be continued. And so, yeah, extremely well done again. And thank you to everybody. Nice to be in the same time space as you, Thomas, as well, after listening for a number of years to you here and there. So there you go. But Layman, Daniel, Cadell, thank you. Wishing you all very well.
So thank you all for being here, and thanks to everyone who's currently listening right now. If you're still with us, you've been, I think, a pretty invaluable ride. Not just in terms of the content. I want to emphasize that, not just in terms of the content, but also in terms of the form of personally including our own self-relation, which I think is integral to making the knowledge come to life. But also in terms of the form of the idea of this being a type of book discussion. So not just for this book, although I do recommend picking up Systems and Subjects. There'll be a link in the description for that. And I want to also, again, extend my thanks to all four of these gentlemen for taking the time to read this book and offer thoughtful reflections and endorsements. It meant a lot. And it's also, I suppose it meant a lot because it's rare, because I asked more than 4 people, and it's a lot of people wouldn't put in that time. And so I appreciate that each of you did put in the time, and the message I received was substantial. I could tell there was thought there, and that means a lot. But on a larger scale of the form, what I want to say as a final reflection is a defense of the book. Not this book, but of books as such, because if I was to say one thing that I would hope going forward in the intellectual communities that we're loosely, our networks overlap in various dimensions, is that there is many thought leaders who don't write books and don't take stands with books. And I think that's a big shame. And I think that there's something about the book writing process which changes you, and it demands something of you. And it does require taking a stand. And this space is one where, if we can not only cultivate writing and inspire writing in the next generation, writing which is connected to the heart, writing which is coming from a real drive, writing which is not just because there's a book deadline at the university or something like that, or a journal which you need to get into in order to get a certain job, but a writing which is coming because I need to write this. and I have to write this, and I want to leave the world with this. That's an important energy to rep for and to stay with, and also, in my experience of writing books, to try to experiment with ways in which the book can be also connected to real people in community context. So that's something that, anyway, that's something that I'm trying to do with Philosophy Portal. And hopefully this conversation, for those of you still listening, maybe sparks something inside of you. Maybe there's a book inside of you, and maybe there's a group of friends that you have who might be interested in reading it. And maybe they might want to have a conversation about it and reflect on it in the context of their lives and in the context of their becoming. Okay, so I'll leave on that note. Systems and subjects, link in the description. Thanks to Layman Pascal, Thomas Hamelrick, Daniel Garner of O.G. Rose, and Tim Adalin. There'll be links in the description to the Integral Stage, which is Layman Pascal's channel. There'll be links to Thomas Hamelrick's professional page, which he's organized all of his publications and work. O.G. Rose's channel, which I recommend, and also O.G. Rose has just released Belonging Again, and I recommend picking that up. And Tim Adalin, there'll be a link to Voicecraft, and he is always holding space, and as he said, open to sharing space. And so all worthy initiatives. Thank you for watching, and have a great evening.